I remember when I was a freshman in college that I heard one of the professors make this comment. He said, "A man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument." And I was impressed by that, although I really didn't think deeply about it. And I thought back on that statement many, many times thereafter, and gradually came to the realization that the statement really isn't all that sound. Because even if we have an experience that is powerful and life-transforming, that experience is still open to interpretation and to evaluation and to analysis. And it's possible for any one of us to have a profound experience that we misunderstand profoundly. And of course, the most significant experience that I ever had in my life was the personal experience of my conversion to Christianity. My conversion to Christianity was one of those Damascus Road affairs, where it was sudden, it was dramatic, and in a sense catastrophic. Not catastrophic in the negative sense, but catastrophic in the sense that it created a massive upheaval in my life. And I was so excited about my conversion to Christ that I went immediately and told every friend of mine, in fact, every person that I met. If I was riding a bus, I would talk to the person that was sitting next to me, because I couldn't imagine why anybody in the world wouldn't be thrilled to hear about this exciting thing that I had discovered in my life. I really felt like a person who had discovered the pearl of great price and thought that everyone had an equal admiration for that sort of jewelry as I had recently acquired. But I soon discovered that in fact that was not the case. And people, in many cases, simply didn't believe what I was saying, and others found it necessary to explain for me my experience. They would criticize it, they would analyze it, they would deny it. And the argument that I heard, I think, more often than any argument, was this. They said, "R.C., don't you see what has happened to you? What has happened to you is that you have come to religion because you needed some kind of crutch to assist you through life. You needed what Karl Marx had called the opiate for the masses, some kind of bromide that would make the difficulties of your existence more bearable. And so, out of some deep-rooted psychological need of one kind or another, you have entered into this religious experience." And they said, "Don't you realize that what you've done is that you've allowed fantasy to replace reality? That you have experienced a common error of the creative imagination of human intelligence that the psychologists call wish projection. Because you want to believe in God, because you want to believe that there's someone out there who will cleanse you of your sense of guilt that has tormented you, who will deliver you from the fear of death, who will promise you significance and meaning in your life and all of these things, that you have projected that wish into a reality and have now, therefore, taken up the crutch of religion." I found that one of the most disturbing and troubling questions that I had to grapple with as a young Christian, because I knew that there was an element of truth contained, to a point at least, in the inquiry. I couldn't deny that I wanted my faith to be true. I couldn't deny that it would have been personally devastating for me to discover the next week or the next day that I had put my faith in Christ in vain. I could not deny that I wanted it to be true. I certainly wanted to know that I was forgiven of my sins. I certainly wanted to know that there was a heaven. I certainly wanted to believe that there was a God who said that my life was meaningful and significant. And I couldn't deny those things. But there were plenty of friends of mine in the academic world particularly who had no problem denying those things. And I became a philosophy major and spent most of my time reading the writings of skeptics rather than of believers. And then later on, when I was teaching at Temple University in Philadelphia at the Conwell School of Theology, one of the elective courses that I taught there was for upper level students, for graduating seniors. And I taught an elective in the philosophy of atheism. And what I did in that course was I required that the students read the primary sources, the primary documents of what are usually considered to be the most formidable critics of historic theism and Christianity. I made them read, for example, the writings of David Hume, of Ludwig Feuerbach, of Karl Marx, of Sigmund Freud, of Walter Kaufmann, of Albert Camus, of Jean-Paul Sartre, of Bertrand Russell, and so on. And that it was a requirement of this course that we would read the arguments of the atheists and then try to grapple with their particular assertions. Now, one of the things came through very loudly and very clearly in that analysis, and that is that in virtually all of those philosophers whom I have mentioned, at one point or another, they came to the conclusion that the reason why people believe in God is fundamentally driven by some psychological need. That is, psychological need is the mother of all religion. And I was interested particularly in 19th century philosophical thought. The 18th century had witnessed the what was called in Germany the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, and one of the main precepts of the European Enlightenment was the principle espoused by the French encyclopedists, who said that now with our advances in modern science, the God hypothesis is no longer a necessary hypothesis to explain the origin of the cosmos or the beginnings of human life. Now we can look to other natural causes to explain the universe without appealing to primitive forms of religion as a basis for reality. By the middle of the 19th century, the climate of philosophical skepticism was such that in the main, philosophers were not debating the question, does God exist? It was tacitly assumed by most of them as a foregone conclusion that God does not exist. And so the question most of the able atheists of the 19th century were addressing was this question: since there is no God, why is it that man seems to be incurably homo religiosus? Everywhere we go, whatever culture we examine, we find evidence and manifestation of some form of religious expression and religious belief that is deeply rooted in the culture. And it's not something that is limited to or contained within the confines of primitive, ignorant people. We find people profoundly intelligent who are as vehement in their affirmation of the existence of God as the atheists were in their denial. And they said, how can we account for that? Now, let me just pause for a second and see what was already appearing as the beginning of a philosophy of phenomenology. The question was not one of metaphysics, is there a God? We can't get up and climb up and beyond the realm of physics and penetrate those questions. What we need to know is, in the arena we can investigate this world. Not only can we investigate the forces of physics in this world and of chemistry and of biology, we can also examine anthropology. We can examine people. And one of the things we can do is that we can see that people here, one of the phenomenon that we see is that they tend to be religious. So we ask, why? We need to account for it. Just as a scientist in his laboratory has to give some kind of sufficient or efficient causal explanation for the data that he examines, so these historians of thought were trying to come up with a causal explanation for the advent of religion. And ladies and gentlemen, virtually every one of these people came up with some explanation rooted and grounded in psychology. Feuerbach, he noticed, for example, that no matter what culture he examined, the cultural expressions of their religion tended to depict gods that looked like mirror images of the people themselves. That if they went to an Aborigine native in Australia, their deity looked like an Australian Aborigine rode around in a canoe. If they went to an outpost in Alaska, they would find that their deity was described to look like an Eskimo. And it seems that people began to create God in their own image, rather than understand themselves being created in God's image. And so Feuerbach said, all that God is, in our concept, is a projection of human characteristics elevated to the super or to the nth degree, sort of as a cosmic Superman. We understand power as a human trait. We just absolutize that, and we say God is omnipotent, all-powerful. We understand that human beings are capable of knowledge. They have science. We raise that to the nth degree and say God is a being who is omniscient. He has all knowledge, and so on. Karl Marx, as you well know, sought an economic explanation for the advent of religion. He said that the history of mankind is basically the history of the conflict of economic clashes between economic groups and so on. And he says in any world, in any society, those who control the wealth will always be in a minority, and the poor will always be in a majority. And the problem that the wealthy have is simple. How are we going to control the masses? How are we going to stop the masses from rising up in rebellion, attacking us, and taking the wealth and distributing it equally among themselves? And Marx says the twofold way that the wealthy control the masses are these. On the one hand, the wealthy control the legislation, so that Lady Justice removes her blindfold, according to Marx, and the law begins to reflect the vested interests of the ruling classes. The law will discriminate against certain groups who are not in power. He said that will happen. He said, but the most important tool that the owner has to control the slave, that the rich have to control the poor, is the tool of religion. Because what religion does is that it promises to the poor a better life in heaven, on the other side of the Jordan. If they be good slaves now and behave themselves on the plantation, then someday, by and by, swing down sweet chariot, or however that goes, and they're going to get carried away home to the other side of Jordan, and everything's going to be great. But in the meantime, they have to be humble, and they have to work, and they have to mind their own business, and they have to behave themselves, while the rich man enjoys all of the wealth here and now. So you put them to sleep with drugs of religion. That's the theory. Freud, of course, had more than one explanation, but his basic explanation was that man is afraid of nature because we're vulnerable to nature. We can be harmed or killed by the tornado, by the fire, by the flood, by disease. And you can't negotiate with these forces. And so what we do is that we begin to personalize impersonal forces and begin to believe that there's a God that resides in the fire and a God that resides in the flood. And we have a God for this and a God for that. And if we pray to those gods, appease those gods, give homage to those gods, maybe they will treat us kindly and remove the threat of nature from us. Now, again, I don't have time in this brief period to canvass the basic theses here of these different philosophers. But the rudimentary principle is religion is the invention that comes out of some deep-rooted psychological need. I don't need to labor that anymore, do I? I think we've all heard it enough. Now, I want to say this in response. When somebody is accused of a crime in our criminal justice system, it is the task of the prosecution to prove the charges against the accused. And part of the procedure in police work and so on is to discover motive, means, and opportunity. If a person can establish that they had no possible opportunity or no possible means to commit the crime, it's very difficult to prove the crime against them, isn't it? But just because we prove that somebody has the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit a crime does not mean that the person is guilty. We may be able to show, for example, if one person is murdered, we may be able to find 50 different people that had a motive to kill that person, had the opportunity to kill that person, and had the wherewithal to do it. You need more than that to convict of the crime. I hope we understand that. Now, I have no quarrel with Freud or Marx or Feuerbach or Sartre or Kaufmann or any of this in terms of their making it very clear that human beings indeed do have the capacity to invent religion. I think we have to admit that freely. We have brains, we have the ability to project ideas, we have the ability to project wishes, we have the ability to be engaged in fantasy. We know that. And I think that it's theoretically possible, if there is no God, I think it's possible that people could invent one. We have the motive, we have the means, we have the opportunity. I don't think we'd invent the God of Scripture. I don't think we'd invent a God who's holy. I don't think we'd invent a God who demands perfect obedience to him with the threat of everlasting torment if we fail in that. But that's another story. But I'm granting at the outset that we do have a psychological motive to invent God. But what I'm pleading for in this brief message this evening is to understand two things. That just because man has the ability to invent God does not mean that that's how the idea of God came about. It's also more than possible that the reason why the world is incurably religious is because there is a God who has so clearly and manifestly demonstrated his existence to mankind that knowledge of him is virtually inescapable. That's another alternative explanation. But more important to the point right now is that we have to say to our atheist friends, hold the phone a minute. I'm willing to grant to you that I have a vested interest in believing in God. Are you willing to grant to me that there are also powerful psychological motives that many people have to deny the existence of God? That the worst news that some people I know could ever discover is that there's a God who will hold them accountable for their lives. Because if there is a bias, the bias can be in the other direction. There's a strong reason why I wouldn't want God to exist, namely that if I have sinned, if God exists, then I understand that I am guilty before him and that I am going to be held ultimately accountable. And if that's the way, if I am in a relationship to God that is one of alienation and estrangement and disobedience, then I hope with all of my heart and soul that he doesn't exist. Do we understand that? And now what I'm trying to say is the question of the existence of God can never be resolved on the basis of our psychology. That's a question that we have to deal with on other grounds, on objective grounds of objective philosophical argument, not on the basis of what my psychological disposition is or what your psychological disposition is. I have to say at the outfit, yes, I want there to be a God. And if you're going to be honest with me, tell me, and maybe you're saying to me, oh, I do too, R.C. Boy, I really want to believe it. Please persuade me of it. You know, and if that's your disposition, put it on the table. If your disposition is, boy, that's the last thing I hope is true. But the point is, nobody's neutral about this question. I've never met somebody that was neutral. Because there is no neutrality when it comes to moral responsibility, ultimately. And you know what I've noticed in my debates with atheists is that I almost never meet somebody who said, oh, how I wish that were true. And that surprises me, because I can't imagine why any human being wouldn't want it to be true that there is a God who is willing to forgive them of every sin that they've ever committed. A God that will give them life that will go forever. A God that will guarantee to them that everything that takes place in their existence is significant. And there's no such thing as futility in your labor. Maybe what people have is that they're afraid to believe it because it's too good to be true. I mean, they have been disappointed so many times in their lives by believing things that didn't come to pass as they had hoped, that they're almost saying, hey, you know, I don't dare believe that. But usually what I'm engaged with in discussions with atheists is with a spirit of hostility. People seem to be saying, man, that's bad news. Don't talk to me about the existence of God. Now, long before Freud and Marx and Feuerbach and these people ever speculated on the question of the psychology of theism, the Apostle Paul, centuries ago, set forth in his philosophical framework a psychology of atheism. The New Testament gives a rational explanation for why there might be, in fact is, a negative bias deeply rooted in the human heart against the existence of God. And again, I would like to take a few minutes to look at that treatment, which is well known as it is found in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. Beginning in chapter 1, verse 18, we read this report. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now let me just quickly comment on this introductory verse to this segment of the epistle. First of all, the word that the apostle uses here that is translated wrath is the word orge. It's one of the words in the Greek language that can be translated anger or wrath. We get a different English word from it. You may be able to guess what word that is. It's the word orgy. Now, we don't think of orgies in terms of anger, do we? We use the term orgy to describe an unrestrained, unrestricted, unbridled involvement or manifestation of sensuality and sex and partying and all the rest. An orgy. A liberation of human passion without restraint. The point of contact linguistically between the English word orgy and the Greek word orge, that is the word for wrath, has to do with the expression of passion. Unbridled passion. The link is this. What the apostle is saying here is not only that God's experiencing wrath about something. He's not saying that God is merely irritated or annoyed or is simply angry. But really the force of this teaching is that God is furious. That God in heaven is enraged about something. Now, I know that's difficult for us to conceive of because we've been brainwashed, if you will, for a couple of hundred years about the character of God, so much so that in 20th century American culture we think that it's unthinkable that the deity would even be capable of being mildly displeased about anything. We have so defanged God and turned him into a cosmic Mr. Rogers, you know. What a wonderful day, and then, you know, I love you just exactly and precisely as you are. But the God of Scripture is a God who's capable of being angry when human beings violate other human beings. And when human beings trample truth. And when human beings desecrate that which is holy. God is angry. And so Paul begins this, and incidentally, Paul is beginning this epistle, which is his monumental work, his magnum opus, on the grace of God. If you read the rest of the epistle. But basically what the apostle was trying to do is show here that you can't understand grace as grace until you understand, first of all, the reality of God's wrath. And so he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against what? I remember early on in the 20th century, some of the existential theologians reacted against the maudlin sentimentality of 19th century theology that had stripped God of any capacity for anger, and then got so intoxicated with their rediscovery of the wrath of God that they said not only is God's wrath real, but at times it's irrational. That there's a demonic element to God himself. There's a shadow side to God's personality. Almost a Jekyll and Hyde thing, yin and yang, good and evil, within God himself. And he has these temper tantrums. Now, the idea of an irrational eruption of anger in God himself would indicate God's becoming violently angry with no just cause. Arbitrary wrath. Flying off the handle for no good reason. But that's not what Paul is talking about. He says the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. There is a reason for his anger. It's a twofold reason. This is really a hendiades as a Greek structure here in the language, which it simply means that two different words are used to point to one particular problem. What Paul is saying, get this, think carefully, is that God is enraged because of a particular sin that God regards as both being unjust and irreligious. It's unrighteous and ungodly. It's not only unethical, but it is irreverent and blasphemous. There's one sin that Paul has in view here. Listen to what it is. Who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. If you want to know what ignites the fury of God, it is the suppression of his revealed truth. My translation, at least, uses the term suppress. Some of you have different translations, and other translations that I've read of that text in Romans say that some who hold the truth in unrighteousness. I've read repress the truth. I've read hinder the truth. I've read stifle the truth. The verb is the verb that comes from the Greek word katakain. Katakain, which means to hold down against resistance. It's the term that is used in the New Testament when the apostles are held against their will in prison. They're incarcerated. The image that the verb suggests is this. If there were a giant spring with heavy, thick coils, and for me to compress that spring, I would have to press down upon it on all my might. But the only way I could keep the spring down is if I kept pressing down on it, because the moment I released the pressure, the spring would come back up. Katakain. It has a positive meaning when Paul admonishes his disciple Timothy and says to him, hold fast that which you have received. It's the same verb. Hang on to it. Don't let it go. Exert all the power you can to keep it in your grasp. That's the force of this verb, katakain. But again, Paul says that God is angry because people are suppressing unrighteously, immorally, unethically, some kind of truth. What kind of truth? Is it some kind of political conspiracy that's been covered up? Is this Watergate that we're talking about in the first century? No, if you excuse the pun, it's Heaven Gate that is being covered up, because Paul goes on and specifies what he's just spoken of in general terms previously to this. He says, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. He's talking about the knowledge of God. What the apostle is saying is that God is angry because human beings are suppressing a knowledge of God. A knowledge that God himself has revealed to the world. And what he says here, again, in verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. And I want us to understand here that the word that is translated in my version by the English word evident is the word phaneros, which in Latin is the word manifestum. That is, this knowledge of God of which the apostle is speaking is not some vague, esoteric, arcane, secret, hidden knowledge that only some Gnostic elitist with a super intelligent capacity could ever discern. But rather it is the knowledge of God Himself that is manifest, that is clear, and that it is clear to the whole world. It's that same knowledge that Scripture elsewhere says that the heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows forth His handiwork. I was listening to a talk show one night, radio talk show, where they had an atheist philosopher, they had a Roman Catholic Jesuit theologian, and a Protestant theologian. And they were debating arguments for the existence of God. And they were getting in all kinds of sophisticated debates about the ontological argument and the cosmological argument and so on. And then they started receiving phone calls. And they got a call from a woman who was obviously uneducated and unsophisticated. And she used broken grammar and poor grammar to express her protest. I don't know what's wrong with you people. Why don't you just go outside and open your eyes? You know? She was saying, it's clear. It's manifest. How can you miss it? People say to me, he said, Sproul, do you think you can prove the existence of God? I said, with the greatest of ease. They said, give me some evidence. I take my shoe off. I said, look at that. That proves conclusively, compellingly, demonstratively the eternal existence of Almighty God. Oh, they say, you mean you're giving probable evidence? No, I'm giving certainty. I said, why? I said, if it exists, if you see a shoe here, if there's anything here that's a shoe, then something exists necessarily. Something has the power of existence in and of itself, eternally, or the simplest child can understand nothing could possibly exist now. Because if there was ever a time when there was nothing, this is a manifest impossibility. And if anything exists, something has to have the power of being in it. What could be more simple? If it doesn't have the power of being in itself, then nothing could be. See? You don't even need the heavens to declare that. Just look at your shoe. But that's another story. But in any case, verse 20 makes the indictment all the more severe. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power, that's just what I was talking about, His eternal power, His divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now there's a couple things I want you to notice about this text. Since the Kantian watershed in philosophy, those of you who are students of Western thought know that Immanuel Kant said we can no longer be persuaded by the traditional arguments for the existence of God because ultimately they rest on reasoning somehow from this world to the metaphysical realm. And Kant said you can't reason from the seen to the unseen. If Kant's right, Paul's obviously wrong. If Paul's right, then Kant is obviously wrong, because what Paul is saying here is that the invisible things of God, things you can't see, are made known by means of, through the medium of, those things that are made, those things that are seen. There's a fundamental dispute there. You have to check for yourself to see who's more cogent, Paul or Kant. And I beg my Christian fellow philosophers to stop defending Kant and start defending Paul on this point. But in any case, Paul says that the invisible attributes of God, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen and understood through, by means of, what has been made, so that they are without excuse. See, this is not simply an amoral, intellectual question. The question of your affirmation or denial of the existence of God is a matter of consummate moral culpability. What excuse is the apostle pulling away from the atheist here? The one excuse that every atheist, that every agnostic will want to use on the final day of judgment is the excuse of ignorance. God, I didn't know you were there. If I just would have known, I would have believed you, I would have followed you, I would have obeyed you. What's worse than hardcore atheism is allegedly softcore atheism, which goes under the guise of agnosticism. The agnostic says, I'm not going to say there is no God. I just simply don't know whether there's a God because I don't think there's a sufficient evidence to come to a conclusion one way or the other. That terrifies me when I hear somebody say that. I say, because what you're saying now is not only you're not willing to affirm the existence of God, but you are pinning the blame of that unwillingness on God himself for not giving you sufficient information. Be careful here. You are adding insult to injury. If this is true, then what it is saying here is that God has so clearly manifested himself ever since the creation of the world, through everything that is made, that you can never use ignorance as an excuse before God. What Paul is saying is that people claim ignorance as an excuse, but it is a fraudulent claim. I've seen real hostility emerge when we've been in discussions with people who are hostile to Christianity, and we discuss these matters. I say, you're not responsible to me to believe this. You may be responsible to God to believe this, but you're not responsible to me to believe that. You don't have anything to fear from me. I'm not going to persecute you or prosecute you or try to bring any harm or injury to you about these things. But what I'm reading here is that in the final analysis, the affirmation of the existence of God is not an intellectual question, it's a moral one. And if you refuse to affirm the existence of God, you are in moral difficulty with the God you refuse to affirm, if Paul is telling the truth. Now here's the crowning, crushing indictment. Verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Now notice what he says here, that the fundamental sin of the human race, the most basic crime that all of us have committed against God, that at the very time we knew of his existence, we refused to honor him as God. We refused to give proper gratitude to our Creator. You see, the problem with the atheist, according to Paul, is that it's not that the atheist doesn't know God. The problem is he refuses to acknowledge what he knows to be true. And that is dishonest. And I'll say this to people when I'm debating the question of the existence of God. I say, look, I'll debate this with you as long as you want to debate, and I'll try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. But I want to be honest with you. I want you to know I don't trust you. I think you're lying to me. You're telling me you don't believe that there's a God. I don't believe that. I think you know very well there's a God. And you're trying as hard as you can to escape that knowledge. That's what I say to them. And it makes them furious in most cases. But, I mean, I have to say that because that's what the New Testament declares. Paul's not pulling any punches here. And he goes on to say, and here's where the psychology comes in. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Now let me just say this. Verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Ladies and gentlemen, what man usually does with the revelation of God is not turn it into atheism. Our normal reaction to God's divine revelation in nature is to turn it into religion. But a religion of idolatry, where we worship a creature rather than the Creator. And we can do it in the Christian church. When we talk about the sovereignty of God and we talk about the holiness of God and people respond and say to me, I don't believe that stuff, my God's a loving God and all of that stuff, I say, are you sure your God isn't an idol? Your religion, I mean, we all have a basic propensity towards idolatry. That's where we all are coming from. If we would take these categories that Paul has used here in Romans and translate them into modern psychological nomenclature, here's what it would look like. In many views of psychoanalysis, psychiatrists and psychologists are interested in traumatic experiences and the damage they do to us unconsciously, to our psyche. There's constant probing into the secrets of our past to see where we experienced trauma as children and how that baggage can be carried through our entire lives. For example, I may go to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I'm greatly distressed about something, and he begins to take my family history, and he not only listens to the words that I say, ladies and gentlemen, he pays attention to my nonverbal communication. He may ask me about my dreams. He may ask me to take some Rorschach ink blot tests, you know, like the guy that went to the psychiatrist and he gave him all these ink blot tests, and every time the guy saw an ink blot, he gave some erotic sexual explanation. And finally, when it was all done, you know, the psychiatrist said, I can see you're really hung up on sexual imagery. And he said, why do you say that? He said, because every one of these things you interpret it in a sexual manner. And the guy said, well, you're the one that showed me all the dirty pictures. But we understand that we can communicate in other ways besides words. And if that psychiatrist is taking my history and he says, how do you get along with your mother? And I say, Mother? I always got along great with Mother. My mother and I were terrific. I love Mother with all of my heart. And every time I say Mother, I do that. He's reading my body language is saying something exactly the opposite from my words. And the idea with repression is this: that I have a tendency as a human being, if I have a scary experience, an unpleasant experience, a traumatic experience, to try to take the memory of that and bury it as deep as possible into my subconscious. But what modern psychiatry understands is that no matter how much I seek to hold it down, to hinder it, to incarcerate it, to suppress it, or to repress it, that repressed knowledge does not annihilate the memory. It may not be in the conscious mind, but it's there. And like Freud used to say, it was like if you expelled a boy from class, from school, and once you send him out of the classroom, he runs around out in the playground and he picks up pebbles and he comes out, starts throwing little stones at the window to let everybody know he's still out there. Well, those traumatic memories that we have are like the little boy. They keep throwing stones up. And we start getting, we get these uncomfortable symptoms from the past and we're not even aware why. So because repressed knowledge seeks to come back to the surface. But when it comes up, ladies and gentlemen, it comes up disguised. It'll come out in a dream, in a strange symbol, in a strange tick or gesture, because it is too scary to come out in the form it went in. And so what we do is that we bring it back out, according to modern psychiatry, in a substituted form that is less threatening. We exchange the original idea for a counterfeit. This is exactly what the Apostle Paul is saying is the fundamental psychology of the human race with respect to God. That the scariest thing to a sinful person in all of the world is the holiness of God. And when God reveals His righteousness and His holiness to us, that is so scary to us that what we do is that we bury it as deeply as we possibly can in the depths of our psyche, but it cannot be destroyed. And there's a relationship between katakain in verse 18 and in the word metalasso in verse 25, which means exchange. We repress, then we exchange. We exchange the truth of God for a lie. We exchange the majesty of God for an idol. We exchange the law of God for human religion or for the denial of God. Because we have a deep psychological bias against a God who is holy. I remember reading a sermon by Jonathan Edwards where he titled it, Man, Naturally God's Enemy. He said there were certain things about God that men don't like. God is holy. He is all-powerful. And we don't like someone who is so holy to also be more powerful than we are. And he goes on to some other reasons for that. And then he says the thing we also hate is that God is immutable. And I thought, why? Why does that bother us, that God is immutable? Because Edwards says, you know, if I find a holy man, I may be able to bribe him and corrupt him and make him just like me. If I find a powerful man, a holy man who is powerful, he can get old and die. But God doesn't get old and die. And God is incorruptible. Not only is He holy now, but He's holy forever. He's never going to negotiate it. We have no hope that He'll ever negotiate it. And that terrifies us. So the bottom line is, if we're going to debate the existence of God, I think it would be wise to do it on grounds other than the psychological desirability or undesirability of Him. Because if we're talking about Yahweh, the God of Israel, we're talking about a God that people have every driving passion to deny.